I'm a Rivals of Aether tournament organizer, and one of the first things that I'm always asked by new players is who's good? I always tell them everyone's good in this game. There's not a bad rival. Sure, based on the patch, there might be a few characters that stand out as a little stronger than the rest, but that's never by a crazy amount. This leads to this new player picking Edlis or Raster and deciding that I spun them a little fairy tale, that I lied to make the game seem more appealing, and that the character they picked is simply impossible to win with. This, however, isn't true. I was honest. You can win with characters like Raster and Edlis, but they're incredibly hard to learn since they're unlike any other character in the genre, meaning that someone familiar with the game like Smash Bros. Or Brawlhalla would be flying blind playing them. Today, I thought I'd fix that issue. I asked over 100 players in my community a few weeks ago to rank each character in the game from a difficulty scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being extremely easy and 10 being incredibly difficult. I also left a note to responders that they could rank characters the same difficulty, as well as not necessarily needing to rank someone a 1 or 10 at all if you felt that those labels didn't apply to a character. For example, let's say if you think Crag and Raster are both 4s out of 10. You could give them the same rank. And if you thought Zetterburn was the hardest character, but you thought he was only a 7 out of 10 difficulty-wise, you could do that too. These choices would make you a little weird and an outlier, but I took any response that I could get. I also asked a few extra questions to get a bit more details on responses from the players. To start the questionnaire, I pulled their rank, and to wrap up the questionnaire, I asked players what they considered when judging a character's difficulty, as well as leaving an open-ended text box to allow players to explain the response. This will come in handy later on, and help me break down what actually makes each character difficult. But for now, let's look at the results of those first 2 questions, with the first one being, what was the player's rank? Normally, when I ask players their rank, there's a pretty wide range of players. This time, however, 33% of our players were in Platinum and 36% in Gold, meaning we are pulling data from the middling elo this time around. There was about a 15% response rate from players above Platinum, and about a 16% response rate from people below Gold. I think it'd be interesting to see how the chart changes when we look at just the data from the high elo players. So, at the end of the video, I'll do a separate chart with just their responses. With that out of the way, let's look at what players considered when ranking characters. The majority of responders, with a resounding 84%, said that they primarily considered the skill floor of a fighter, which is how difficult a character is to pick up and play with them. Skill floor doesn't incorporate the ideas that a master of the character would necessarily need to know, but more so the ideas needed to start with the character. Players also value the inverse, the skill ceiling, pretty highly too. It's 64%. Skill ceiling, as I said, is the inverse of the floor, meaning how hard it is to fully master a character and understand all their niche tech. Speaking of niche tech, that was also something highly rewarded as well as how I feel in the character, meaning that if a player didn't like how the character felt, whether they be slow, clunky, or just obtuse, they might rank that character a little harder to play, since they might not be as forgiving. Now that we understand who's ranking the characters, and the thought process going into how to rank them, let's start our chart. I'll be using a bit different looking of a tier list today, with 2 axes. Our x-axis will rank characters on how hard their execution, or more specifically, how hard it is to time their combos or how tight their input windows are, and the other axis will rank their game plan. For example, if a character has a pretty straightforward point-and-click game plan, they'd be ranked a lot easier on the scale than someone who wouldn't necessarily need to manage a resource as a core part of their kit. I'll post a simpler, easier to read tier list at the end, so if you're a new player or feeling a bit lost along the way, there will be no need to worry. To get started, let's start with the easiest characters and work our way up to the most difficult ones. For our easiest fighter in Rivals 2, we have everyone's favorite, Peaceful Dove, Loxodon. Loxodon is the game's heavy, disjoint fighter, meaning that he both benefits from the ease of use that heavies are commonly known for, as well as having the benefit of taking lots of space and not needing to aim his moves with as much precision as some of the other fighters. His axe is super large, giving him lots of range, and this isn't to say that you shouldn't be spacing with it, but moves being so generous play a big role in players being drawn to him. If you're a new player and looking to learn the game, Loxodon, in my opinion, is a great character to start with, since he teaches you all the game's more complex mechanics without being a complex character. His magma pools can be a little tricky to manage, but they only benefit you and are pretty easy to place, so I don't see a need to rank Loxodon very high at all on either end of the axis. Our second easiest fighter is Crag. Crag benefits from the same heavyweight benefits as Loxodon, but his moves are a little smaller and a touch less generous. Overall though, his moves are still massive and pretty hard to miss, and where Loxodon struggles in recovery, Crag then more makes up for it. His up B is really simple to use, and can lead to some silly early gimps that enable new players to find creative routes without needing to push past high execution barriers. His main mechanic being his rock is also pretty easy to use and understand, past simply when and where to use it. I had a few responders mention that swapping to Crag let them see a lot more success on him, especially towards the lower and more middling elos, since his game plan and execution are both fairly simple, and give big rewards to players who are looking to land simple 1-2 kill confirms like back air forward air, or are able to call out sloppy opponents with moves like forward strong. Overall, Crag is almost as simple as Loxodon, but without the same lows as the Elephant Emperor. This will lead us into ranking Crag only slightly higher in the execution section, and no increase on the game plan compared to Lox. Next up, we have Loxodon's best friend Clarin. I personally don't think that Clarin is everyone's cup of tea, and that reflected in her scores, with a handful of users ranking her really hard, while most ranked her super easy, which was a lot different compared to Loxodon and Crag, who are kinda universally ranked to be the easiest fighters. Clarin is pretty simple for similar reasons to Loxodon. The big disjoint is easy to use, and the tipper is pretty generous, and even with the non-tipper, her hits are not so terrible to land. She doesn't have any weird mechanic outside of the tipper stun, so similarly to Loxodon's Magma, it's more of a passive buff and a bonus if you're able to get it, and not really something that you need to go out of your way to activate or play around, especially at the lower elos. It's just something that's there as long as you space your moves, which is good to do anyways. With that being said, if you want to move past beginner level with Clarin, you are going to have to learn how to space moves properly, and even though the tippers are pretty large, it is a challenge if you're just starting out. Some responders also noted that while she is easy to learn, some of her more complex combos and finishers can be a little bit tricky to get down, like spacing for the second hit of forward air, or landing an aerial neutral special. With this being said, let's place Clarin a little higher than Loxodon on both axes, not by too much though. Before we keep it going, I would love to ask you really quickly to leave a like if you're rocking with the video. These videos take a few weeks to put together, and leaving a like on the video lets me know that you enjoy the community polls and topics like these. So, if you want to see more of it, go ahead and do your big one down there. Getting back to the video in our fourth fighter, we're getting out of the pretty easy characters. That's not to say that any of the upcoming fighters are crazy difficult, but I think that Lox, Crag, and Clarin were all universally voted low, with the next fighters having a bit more nuance in their difficulty. To start this group off, let's go with Zitterburn. Zitterburn is pretty simple when it comes to his game plan, but as a character who wants to combo opponents for big damage, and relies on kill confirms to take stocks, it can be a little tricky to rack up percents at a lower skill level. Around mid and high level, Zitterburn becomes a lot easier, with super generous combos and easy to use kill confirms. However, we can't rate him too high, since his projectile also smooths out his game plan a lot, since he's not reliant on only needing to get in, and can use the extra space to position defensively or bait opponents to approach him riskily. Adding this all up, I think I'll drop Zitterburn in the middle of the execution complexity tier, and low on the game plan axis, since there are some combos that he wants to get that are pretty tight, but in the grand scheme of things, I would not consider him too hard to pilot. Olympia's up next with pretty similar ideas to Zitterburn. Her responses had a mixed set of results, since her game plan is pretty simple and doesn't take a lot of learning past how to use Crystal, but some of her combos have tight timings in some situations, especially when it knows how to confirm a hitfall and continue a combo, or when to cut it short with one of her super strong aerial finishers. Some notable points left by the community were that Olympia can kinda get away with mashing, especially at a lower elo, and her tech skill isn't quite as difficult as some of the characters that will be ranking higher up. This leaves Olympia with a good bit higher than our previous fighters in the execution category, but not too far above them in the game plan terms. Next up, we have a character that I always group as Zetter and Olympia in my head, in terms of gameplay, being Rano. Truthfully, there's not much to say about Rano that I haven't already said about Olympia and Zetterburn, since he has generous moves that linger, pretty simple kill confirms, mashy options, and a handful of complex combos that keep him challenging. However, where Rano differs is his tech and execution barrier around his tongue sling. Responders noted that Rano's ability to camp with needles, combo out of landing needles, and mix up his recovery added a lot more depth to his gameplay, even if these techniques weren't necessarily harder to input than something like a Zetterburn Shine combo. This makes Rano a first on our list, since we'll be putting him behind Olympia in the execution category, but above her in Zetterburn on the game plan axis. With those three out of the way, we start to enter our more difficult half of the tier list. These characters all have something in their kit that makes them notably challenging, without a lot of tools that you can get to get seemingly free value. To kick us off in this category, we have Edlis, who's not only hard to combo with, but also has a more complex mechanic, being his ice. In case you weren't aware, Edlis' dash attack goes further on ice, and can be cancelled into jump or up strong. The main goal of this move is to open up combos, or kill opponents with a fast, massive burst option. But you have to set up the ice first, adding a layer to both his execution and to his game plan to get it moving. A lot of the notes I got about Edlis were focused around him being more difficult due to his bad disadvantage in recovery. However, I don't really have a way to show that very well on this chart. Overall, Edlis isn't the most complex character to combo with, but he's far from easy, so I'll line him up slightly behind Zetterburn in this tier, but rank his overall game plan the hardest so far. Maple is up next. She's known for having big combos and interesting set play pieces, which are seen in her plant pals. Some of her moves are really generous when comboing, like up air and forward air, since they have tons of hit stun and can connect into themselves. This means that once Maple gets a combo started, she's not having trouble keeping it rolling at all. But a few commenters noted that unlike Rano or Zetterburn, Maple can have a really tricky time getting the ball moving, since her low percent combo starters need a bit of precise spacing and timing to get the full effectiveness out of them. This is not to say that it's impossible or anything like that, they just require a bit more familiarity than other options in this category. Looping back to those plant pals that I mentioned, Maple has a few different set play options. However, a common trend in the comments were that Maple's set play pieces didn't need much effort to keep them going is something like Arcane Puddle, since Lily attacks opponents on her own. So while this option does add some complexity to Maple's game plan, it's not quite as much as a few other fighters' tools. With these ideas in mind, we'll rank Maple at a decently high difficulty on both scales. Our next rival is Forestburn. Truthfully, Forestburn and the character after him are a fraction of a decimal apart on the rankings, so he was kinda hard to rank. Forestburn has tons of special unique tools that make him a much more challenging fighter to pick up, while also being trickier at high level, since managing things like smoke, your smoke charges, and clone can add up in your mental stack. Forestburn's execution, however, is one area where he's not that hard, to be honest. A lot of responders noted this, saying that they had a difficult time ranking Forestburn, since on one hand, he has one of the most complex game plans, but on the other, he doesn't have a lot of frame type confirms or anything too challenging input-wise. This will lead me to ranking him pretty low on that axis, but one of our highest so far on the game plan tier. As I mentioned, this rival had a really similar score to Forestburn, and it's Arcane. Arcane is really fast on the ground and has a lot of unique movement tech. However, he suffers in the air and lacks a real hitbox in front of him while he's there. This combined with Droplet and Puddle makes for some pretty unique game plans, since Arcane is presented with the challenge of being strong in some aspects and lacking in others. The skill required to properly combo with Arcane, however, really isn't all that crazy. I'm an Arcane player, and this hurts me to say, but nothing in Arcane's kit is as difficult as someone like Edelis's, Zetterburn's, or Maple's to do execution-wise. Sure, you need a hitfall and a wave dash, but that's not something exclusive to my little whale buddy. With all this in mind, I'm ranking Arcane right by Forestburn, just a little harder to execute with, and a bit more complex of a game plan, since you need to be aware of how to properly apply tools like Puddle and Hydroplane, instead of passively benefiting from them, like Maple's buddy Lily. Our next fighter is Fleet, who's already grouped pretty close by the responders to Orcane and Forceburn. However, for slightly different reasons. Sure, she has a level of set play and complexity to her game plan, but not to the same degree as the previous two fighters, where they need to be managing a resource to guarantee success. In a sense, I guess you could say that Fleet does manage a resource, but it's not something that relies on the opponent interacting with it, so it's not quite as complicated. However, what does make Fleet complicated is her tight combos and slow fall mechanic. These are pretty hard to properly combine on top of her projectiles, and her not so great movement speed can really add up to Fleet needing to step on the gas when she is able to win neutral. Her kit has all the tools needed to do so, it's just a little tricky to put them together and execute on top of them properly, landing Fleet on the harder end of both axes. The newest fighter, Absa, is up next. Responders didn't have as much time to review her for this survey, so I pushed out a second survey to gain a little bit more context. This unfortunately means that the data pool isn't as large for Absa as the other characters, but I think the final placement of her is overall more or less accurate. Absa, similarly to Orcane, has an active set play playstyle piece that she can place on the field anywhere she wants, meaning that not only is she looking to combo opponents for her gain, but she's also looking to combo them into her cloud and use that to combo back into herself. Her complex movement like gravity jumps, double jump cancels, and unique up B angles make her pretty hard to fully learn, as well as pass the knowledge check of being able to actively implement these tools into the game. This culminates in a character who not only has a complex game plan, but also a pretty large amount of precise inputs. Truthfully, before we get it mixed up, the difficulty in inputs isn't from her moves necessarily. Those are all pretty straightforward, but more so from how hard it is to combine complex moves with her normals, which ranks her a little higher on both of the skills than Fleet. For our last rival, you've probably already guessed it, but it's Raster. Raster has one of the hardest game plans, since the current iteration of Slipstream is really tricky to get full use out of, as well as one of the most difficult combo games. The most recent patch did make it a little easier for him, but tools like up B, special pummel, and down air are so tricky to get use out of that he's still notably the hardest character in the game. If you're a new player wanting to play the bird, don't worry, you still can. But you'll need to be ready to learn precise combos, tons of ledge guarding tricks, and a handful of survival techniques, since Raster is super light. This all comes together to make Raster both unforgiving to play and tricky to execute with. If you're a Raster main, congrats, you're definitely doing something right. That goes ahead and wraps up our main chart with everyone's responses. I do want to simplify it just a little bit to clearly show our results. Luxodont, Crag, and Clarin were all ranked notably the easiest by the community, with Zetterburn, Rano, and Olympia being up next in a medium difficulty tier. This tier is defined by them having a varying difficulty within their combos, but overall a pretty simple game plan. With finally, Edelus, Maple, Forceburn, and Orcane all being grouped as pretty tricky characters, without anything super complex or hard to input within their kit, but a few mechanics that might make them a bit more unapproachable for new players. Fleet, Absa, and Raster are all at the top. That was who you guys voted for to be the hardest in the game, based on both their tricky inputs and more complex game plans. If you're a new player watching this, don't let this list deter you from trying who you want. It might just take a little bit more effort and time to fully learn your character at both a base and high level of gameplay if they're on the upper half here. As I promised, I'd reorder the characters based on the high level ELO feedback, being Diamond and up, and here's the changes that I found. Edelus jumps up a few spots and Orcane comes down a few. Most of the other characters stayed the same, more or less. Truthfully, Absa launching made this list a little rocky since we don't have full data on her, but as I said earlier, I imagine that it doesn't impact the new list all too much. As always, thanks tons to everyone that participated in this survey. I'd like to put out a community tier list again in a few weeks, so if that's something you'd like to be a part of, a new Google form is linked down below, asking you to rank each character. Before we go, I also want to let you know about a new project I'm starting here on the channel. Starting this week, instead of a Friday video upload, I'll be hosting a weekly podcast talk show-esque discussion with a member from the Rivals community to go over recent events or a certain topic. This week, I'll be breaking down the difficulties of getting into Rivals of Aether and its characters, building on top of this video's ideas and offering solutions for new players or players looking to expand their characters. So, if that's something you're interested in, be sure to subscribe. I'm super excited to share the podcast with you guys and see what y'all think. Until then though, bye for now.